Tax season has always been my least favorite time of year. Not because of the money, though watching half my income vanish into government coffers never feels great, but because of the paperwork. Mountains of receipts, bank statements, and forms that seem designed by people who hate human happiness. I'm Grant Solen, 49 years old, and I make my living untangling digital messes for corporations that should know better. Former NSA signals analyst, current IT consultant, perpetual skeptic of anything that seems too good to be true, which is probably why I noticed the discrepancy in the first place. Sitting at my kitchen table on a drizzly March evening, surrounded by manila folders and the remnants of a microwaved dinner, I was cross-referencing our joint bank statements when I found it. A monthly automatic withdrawal I didn't recognize. $1,500 every month for the past 18 months, going to something called Metropolitan Property Management. I stared at the entry, coffee growing cold in my mug. We owned our house outright, had for 3 years now. No rent, no mortgage payments. So what was Metropolitan Property Management? And why were we paying them the equivalent of a decent apartment's rent? Lena was upstairs in her home office, probably working late again. Her PR firm had been landing bigger clients lately, which meant longer hours and more business trips. I could hear her voice through the ceiling, animated and professional, probably on a conference call with some client on the West Coast. I pulled up our shared laptop and logged into our banking portal. The payments had started in September 2 years ago. Regular as clockwork, $1,500 on the 15th of every month. I clicked through to the detailed transaction history, looking for any notation or reference number that might explain the charge. Nothing. Just Metropolitan Property Management and a string of numbers that meant nothing to me. My fingers drummed against the table as I considered my options. I could ask Lena directly, but something about the regularity and secrecy of the payments made me hesitant. In my NSA days, I learned that the most interesting intelligence often came from the things people didn't want you to find. Instead, I opened a new browser tab and searched for Metropolitan Property Management. Their website was sleek and professional, advertising luxury apartment rentals in the downtown district. High-end places with names like the Meridian and Harborview Towers. The kind of apartments that cost exactly $1,500 a month. I leaned back in my chair, mind racing. Why would we be paying rent on an apartment I'd never seen? Lena had never mentioned anything about a downtown place. We lived in a perfectly nice suburban house, with plenty of space for both of us, and our 22-year-old daughter, Becca, who was away at college most of the year. The sound of Lena's footsteps on the stairs interrupted my thoughts. I quickly closed the browser tabs and shuffled some papers around, trying to look busy with legitimate tax preparation. "How's it going down there?" she asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway. At 43, Lena still turned heads. Shoulder-length auburn hair, green eyes that could shift from warm to calculating in seconds, and the kind of smile that made clients trust her with their company's reputation. "Same as always," I replied, gesturing at the mess of documents. "The government wants to know about every penny we've spent, and we have to prove we're not lying about it." She laughed, that musical sound that had first attracted me to her 15 years ago. "Well, don't stay up too late. Some of us have early meetings tomorrow." "Speaking of which," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "I'm seeing some charges I don't recognize. Metropolitan Property Management. Ring any bells?" The change was subtle but unmistakable. Her smile flickered for just a moment, and her hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the doorframe. "Oh, that. It's a corporate thing. We're renting a downtown space for client meetings. You know how some of our bigger clients prefer to meet in the city rather than drive out to the suburbs." It was a reasonable explanation, plausible even, but something about the way she delivered it, just a little too smooth, a little too rehearsed, triggered every alarm bell my intelligence training had installed in my brain. "Makes sense," I said, nodding. "Which building? Maybe I know it." "The Meridian," she replied without hesitation. "On 5th Street. Very nice conference facilities." I made a mental note of the building name and turned back to the tax forms. Sounds expensive. You have to spend money to make money, she said, then kissed the top of my head. Don't work too late. I listened to her footsteps retreat upstairs, then waited another 5 minutes before opening my laptop again. The Meridian's website showed a gleaming 40-story tower with retail space on the ground floor and residential units above. No mention of conference facilities or corporate rentals. According to their floor plans, they offered 1- and 2-bedroom apartments ranging from $1,200 to $3,000 a month. The $1,500 range would get you a 1-bedroom on a middle floor. Nice view, modern amenities, perfect for someone who wanted a private space in the city. I spent the next hour researching Metropolitan Property Management, cross-referencing their listings with our bank payments, and building a timeline. The payments had started 2 months after Lena's promotion to senior partner at her firm. They'd continued without interruption, even during months when we'd been tight on money and had to defer some of our own household expenses. By the time I closed the laptop, I had a theory. But theories needed evidence, and evidence required investigation. I'd spent 10 years at the NSA learning how to find things people didn't want found. Time to dust off some old skills. The next morning, I called in sick to work. Not entirely a lie. I felt nauseated by what I suspected I might discover. While Lena left for her early meeting, I drove downtown to the Meridian. The building was exactly as advertised. Sleek, modern, expensive. The kind of place where young professionals and empty nesters paid premium prices for the privilege of walking to work and ordering artisanal coffee from the lobby cafe. I parked across the street and watched the entrance for an hour, trying to spot Lena among the steady stream of residents and visitors. Nothing. But that didn't prove anything. If she was maintaining a secret apartment, she'd be careful about when and how she visited it. The building directory in the lobby listed dozens of units, but no corporate offices or conference facilities. I approached the concierge, a well-dressed man in his 50s who looked like he'd perfected the art of knowing everything while revealing nothing. "Good morning," I said, putting on my most professional smile. "I'm Grant Solen. My wife Lena has been renting space here for business meetings, and I wanted to check on the details for our tax preparation." His expression remained politely neutral. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't discuss individual residents or their arrangements. Privacy policy." "Of course," I replied. "Could you at least confirm which unit she's been using? I have the receipts, but the apartment number isn't clear." "I'd need to see identification and have written permission from the leaseholder," he said. "Building policy." I thanked him and left, but not before noting the security camera positions and the layout of the lobby. Old habits from my intelligence days. Always know the surveillance setup and exit routes. Back in my car, I sat and thought. Lena had lied about the conference facilities, but that didn't necessarily mean she was hiding something sinister. Maybe she'd rented the apartment as a quiet place to work, somewhere she could escape the distractions of home and office. Maybe she'd planned to surprise me with it, or maybe she just needed space and didn't know how to explain that to her husband of 15 years. But the secrecy bothered me. We'd always been partners in financial decisions. Even when she'd wanted to redecorate the living room, or I'd wanted to upgrade my computer setup, we'd discussed it first. A $1,500 monthly expense wasn't something you hid from your spouse unless you had a reason. I drove home and spent the afternoon researching the building's rental policies and procedures. The Meridian required a year-long lease, first and last month's rent upfront, plus a security deposit. That meant Lena had committed at least $4,000 initially, then $1,500 every month since. Over $25,000 of our money spent on something she'd felt the need to lie about. That evening, I waited until Lena was in the shower before checking her home office. Her desk was neat and organized, with client files arranged alphabetically and her laptop closed and locked. I wasn't ready to start hacking her computer. That felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But I did notice something interesting. Her appointment calendar, the paper one she kept for quick reference, showed several entries marked only with DT, followed by a time. Always on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always in the early evening. Downtown meetings, maybe? I photographed the calendar pages with my phone, then returned everything to exactly how I'd found it. When Lena emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, I was back in the kitchen, working on our taxes like a devoted husband. "How's it coming?" she asked, toweling her hair. "Getting there," I replied. "Should have everything ready for the accountant by Friday." She nodded and kissed my cheek. "You're so good at keeping track of all this stuff. I don't know what I'd do without you." The comment stung more than it should have. If I was so good at keeping track of things, how had I missed 18 months of secret apartment payments? And if she didn't know what she'd do without me, why was she hiding something that felt increasingly significant? That night, lying in bed next to my wife of 15 years, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Lena about the apartment. Not yet. Instead, I was going to find out exactly what she was doing there and why she felt the need to lie about it. I'd spent a decade in intelligence work, learning how to uncover secrets and analyze patterns. Time to put those skills to work on the most important case of my life. The next morning, I called my old NSA colleague, Marcus Chen. We'd worked signals intelligence together for 6 years before I'd transitioned to the private sector, and he'd always been better at the technical aspects of surveillance than anyone else in our unit. "Grant Solen," he said, answering on the second ring. "Been a while. What's the occasion?" "I need some advice," I replied. Hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to monitor audio through a shared wall in an apartment building, what would be the most effective approach? Marcus was quiet for a moment. This hypothetical someone wouldn't be planning anything illegal, would they? "Nothing that would violate any laws," I assured him. "Just trying to understand what might be happening in an adjacent unit." "Contact microphones," he said without hesitation. "Small, sensitive, designed for exactly that purpose. You can pick them up online, no questions asked. Attach them to a shared wall, run the signal through an amplifier, and you'll hear conversations like you're in the same room." "What about recording?" "Voice-activated digital recorders. Set them up with the contact mics and they'll capture everything automatically. Just make sure you're not violating any state wiretapping laws. Some places require 2-party consent for recording conversations." I thanked him and spent the next hour researching surveillance equipment online. The technology had advanced significantly since my NSA days. Devices that would have required a van full of equipment 10 years ago were now available as consumer electronics, small enough to fit in your pocket and sophisticated enough to capture conversations through concrete walls. But before I could implement any surveillance, I needed access to the adjacent unit. That meant another trip to the Meridian, this time with a different approach. I dressed in my best suit and practiced my cover story during the drive downtown. Grant Solen, IT consultant, looking for a downtown apartment for his home office. Professional, legitimate, exactly the kind of tenant a high-end building would want. The leasing office was on the 2nd floor, staffed by a cheerful woman in her 30s who introduced herself as Jennifer Walsh. Her desk was covered with floor plans and rental brochures, and she seemed genuinely excited to help me find the perfect apartment. "What kind of space are you looking for?" she asked, pulling up the building's availability on her computer. "Something quiet," I replied. "I work in IT, so I need a place where I can concentrate without distractions. 1 bedroom would be fine, maybe middle floors to avoid street noise." She nodded and scrolled through the listings. "We have several units available. What's your budget range?" $1,500, maybe $1,600 tops." "Perfect. I have 3 units in that range." She turned her monitor so I could see the listings. Unit 4B just became available yesterday. 4th floor, great view of the courtyard, very quiet. My pulse quickened. If Lena was in 4A, then 4B would share a wall with her apartment. That sounds ideal. Could I see it? 20 minutes later, Jennifer was leading me through Unit 4B. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. A mirror image of what I assumed was Lena's layout, with the bedroom and living room sharing walls with the adjacent unit. The apartment was clean and modern, with hardwood floors that would make it easy to move around quietly. The previous tenant was a graduate student, Jennifer explained. Very quiet, no complaints from neighbors. The walls are well insulated, so you shouldn't have any noise issues. I walked to the bedroom wall that would adjoin Lena's apartment and pressed my ear against it. Nothing audible, but that didn't mean the wall was soundproof. With the right equipment, I'd be able to hear everything happening on the other side. "I'll take it," I said. Jennifer blinked in surprise. "Don't you want to see the other units? Compare your options?" "This one feels right," I replied. "When can I move in?" The paperwork took 2 hours. Credit check, employment verification, first and last month's rent plus security deposit. By the end of the day, I had keys to Unit 4B and a lease that started immediately. Driving home, I felt a mixture of excitement and guilt. I was about to spy on my own wife, using skills I'd learned in service of national security to investigate my marriage. It felt like a betrayal, but so did her secret apartment and the lies about conference facilities. That evening, while Lena worked late in her office, I ordered surveillance equipment online. Contact microphones, digital recorders, amplifiers, and a long-range camera lens that could capture images through windows from a distance. Everything would arrive within 2 days, shipped to my new apartment. I also researched the building's security systems and discovered something interesting. The Meridian had security cameras in all common areas, but the footage was only kept for 30 days before being automatically deleted. If I wanted to establish Lena's pattern of visits, I needed to start documenting them immediately. The next day, I took another sick day and positioned myself across the street from the Meridian with a telephoto lens and a notebook. I felt ridiculous, like a private investigator in a bad television show, but I needed to understand when and how often Lena visited the apartment. At 2:47 p.m., I saw her. Lena emerged from a taxi in front of the building, wearing a dress I'd never seen before and carrying a small overnight bag. She moved quickly through the lobby, avoiding eye contact with the concierge, and disappeared into the elevator bank. I noted the time and date, then settled in to wait. If this was a pattern, she might leave after a few hours. If it was something more significant, she might stay longer. She emerged at 6:23 p.m., nearly 4 hours later. The overnight bag was gone, and she'd changed into a different outfit, jeans and a sweater that I recognized from her regular wardrobe. She walked 2 blocks before hailing another taxi, heading in the direction of our suburban home. I checked my watch. If traffic was light, she'd be home by 7. That gave me time to get there first and establish an alibi for my afternoon. "How was work?" she asked when she arrived home 20 minutes after me. "Boring conference calls and server maintenance," I replied. "How about you? Good day at the office?" "Client meetings mostly. You know how it is." I nodded and returned to reading the newspaper, but my mind was racing. She'd been at the apartment for nearly 4 hours in the middle of a weekday. That seemed like more than just a quiet place to work or hold the occasional business meeting. Over the next 3 days, I established a routine. Morning surveillance from across the street, afternoon equipment set up in my new apartment, evening normalcy at home with Lena. The surveillance equipment arrived as promised, and I spent hours learning how to use it properly. Contact microphones were simpler than I'd expected. Small adhesive discs that attached to walls and picked up vibrations from the other side. I placed them strategically along the shared wall between my bedroom and what I assumed was Lena's, then connected them to digital recorders that would activate automatically when they detected sound. The long-range lens was more complex, requiring careful positioning and adjustment to capture clear images through the apartment windows across the courtyard. I set it up in my bedroom, aimed at what appeared to be Lena's living room window. By Thursday evening, everything was ready. I had audio surveillance on the shared wall, visual surveillance through the windows, and a documented pattern of Lena's visits. According to my observations, she came to the apartment every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, usually arriving between 2:30 and 3 p.m. and leaving around 6:30 p.m. I positioned myself in my surveillance apartment that Thursday at 2 p.m., activated all the recording equipment, and waited. At 2:52 p.m., I heard the first sounds through the contact microphones. A door opening and closing, footsteps on hardwood floors, the sound of someone moving around the apartment. Then Lena's voice, muffled but audible. "I'm here. Give me 20 minutes." She was talking to someone, but I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation. Phone call, probably. I adjusted the amplifier settings and tried to filter out background noise. 15 minutes later, I heard another door. Heavier footsteps, definitely male. Then voices, both of them now audible through the wall. "Traffic was terrible," a man's voice said. "I thought I was going to be late." "You're never late," Lena replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "It's one of the things I love about you." My stomach clenched. The tone was intimate, affectionate, nothing like the professional conversations she'd have with a business colleague. I turned up the amplifier and pressed my ear to the wall, straining to hear every word. "Did you bring the papers?" Lena asked. "In my briefcase. Everything you asked for." "Good. We need to be careful about timing. Grant's been asking questions about the apartment." The mention of my name sent a chill down my spine. They were talking about me, planning something that involved the apartment and papers I knew nothing about. "What kind of questions?" the man asked. "He found the payments in our bank statements. I told him it was for client meetings, but he seemed suspicious." "Maybe we should accelerate the timeline." "No," Lena said firmly. "We stick to the plan. A few more months, and everything will be in place." I was recording every word, but I still couldn't identify the man's voice. It was familiar somehow, like someone I'd met before but couldn't quite place. The conversation continued for another hour, but most of it was too quiet to hear clearly through the wall. At 6:15 p.m., I heard movement again. The man was leaving first, just as he'd apparently arrived separately. I grabbed my camera and positioned myself at the window, hoping to get a clear shot of him as he exited the building. The telephoto lens brought the lobby entrance into sharp focus. I waited, finger on the shutter button, ready to capture the face that would explain everything. At 6:23 p.m., a man in an expensive suit emerged from the elevator and walked toward the exit. He paused in the lobby to check his phone, giving me a perfect profile shot. I nearly dropped the camera. The man was Reed Trenner, my divorce attorney and former college roommate, Reed Trenner. The man I'd trusted with my legal affairs for the past 5 years, the college roommate who'd been best man at my wedding, the attorney who'd helped Lena and me draft our wills and navigate the purchase of our house. I sat in the empty apartment, staring at the photograph on my camera's display screen, trying to process what I'd discovered. Reed's face was unmistakable, the same sharp features and prematurely gray hair that had made him popular with clients who wanted a lawyer who looked distinguished and trustworthy. The conversation I'd recorded took on new meaning in light of his identity. Papers in his briefcase, plans that involved timing, references to accelerating timelines, and everything being in place in a few more months. It sounded like they were preparing for something significant, something that required careful coordination between my wife and my lawyer. I packed up the surveillance equipment and drove home in a daze. Lena was already there, cooking dinner and humming softly to herself. She looked relaxed and happy, like someone who'd had a pleasant afternoon with a close friend. "Perfect timing," she said when I walked into the kitchen. "Dinner will be ready in 10 minutes. I nodded and mumbled something about needing to change clothes, then escaped upstairs to our bedroom. I needed time to think, to process what I'd learned and decide what to do next. Reed and Lena were having an affair. That seemed like the obvious explanation for secret afternoon meetings in a downtown apartment. But the conversation I'd recorded suggested something more complex than simple infidelity. They were planning something that involved me specifically, something that required legal papers and careful timing. I thought back to our recent interactions with Reed. He'd handled our estate planning updates 6 months ago, reviewing our wills and updating the beneficiary information on our life insurance policies. He'd also been the one who'd suggested we update our prenuptial agreement, claiming that changes in state law made it advisable to clarify certain financial arrangements. At the time, I'd trusted his advice completely. Reed had been handling our legal affairs for years, and he'd never steered us wrong. But now I wondered if there had been ulterior motives behind his recommendations. Over dinner, I studied Lena's face, looking for signs of deception or guilt. She seemed normal, tired from a long day at work, but otherwise relaxed and conversational. She asked about my day, shared office gossip from her firm, and discussed plans for the upcoming weekend. Nothing in her demeanor suggested she was hiding a secret relationship or planning something that would affect our marriage. But I'd heard the conversation. I'd seen Reed leaving the building. Whatever was happening between them, they were both skilled at maintaining appearances. After dinner, while Lena watched television in the living room, I retreated to my home office and began researching Reed's recent cases and professional activities. If he and Lena were planning something that involved legal papers, there might be clues in his public filings or bar association records. What I found was disturbing. Over the past 2 years, Reed had handled several high-profile divorce cases involving wealthy clients. In each case, he'd represented the wife, and in each case, the settlement had been unusually favorable to his client. The husbands had ended up with minimal assets, while the wives had retained most of the marital property and received substantial ongoing support. I dug deeper into the case files, looking for patterns. In 3 of the cases, Reed had initially represented both spouses in estate planning or business matters before the divorce proceedings began. In 2 cases, the husbands had been caught in compromising situations that damaged their credibility during settlement negotiations. A picture was beginning to emerge, and it wasn't pretty. Reed appeared to specialize in helping wives extract maximum value from their marriages, using his inside knowledge of the family's finances and legal arrangements to structure settlements that heavily favored his clients. I printed out the case summaries and spread them across my desk, looking for connections. The timeline was consistent. In each case, Reed had worked with the couple for months or years before the divorce, building trust and gathering information about their assets and financial arrangements. Then, when the marriage ended, he'd used that knowledge to ensure his client received the lion's share of the marital property. The implications for my own situation were terrifying. Reed knew everything about our finances. He'd helped us structure our investments, draft our wills, and update our prenuptial agreement. If he and Lena were planning to divorce me, they had every advantage. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing our prenuptial agreement, looking for clauses or provisions that might work against me in a divorce proceeding. What I found made my stomach turn. The agreement we'd signed 6 months ago contained several provisions I didn't remember discussing. If either spouse filed for divorce citing adultery, the innocent party would receive a larger share of the marital assets. If either spouse could prove financial misconduct by the other, they could claim additional damages. And if the marriage ended due to irreconcilable differences, the spouse who filed first would have certain advantages in property division. I stared at the document, trying to remember the conversation Reed and I had had about these clauses. He'd explained them as standard protections, ways to ensure that both parties were treated fairly if the marriage ended. I'd trusted his expertise and signed without reading every detail. Now I realized I'd signed my own financial execution warrant. If Lena could prove I'd committed adultery, or even create the appearance that I had, she could claim the majority of our assets. If she could document any questionable financial decisions on my part, she could seek additional damages. And if she filed for divorce first, citing my supposed misconduct, she'd have a significant advantage in settlement negotiations. The pieces were falling into place. Reed and Lena were planning to divorce me, but they needed to create grounds that would work in their favor. They were gathering evidence, building a case, and positioning themselves to extract maximum value from the dissolution of our marriage. I turned off my computer and sat in the dark office, trying to control my anger and plan my response. I could confront them directly, but that would give them time to adjust their strategy or accelerate their timeline. I could file for divorce first, but without evidence of their affair, I'd be fighting blind against opponents who knew all my weaknesses. Or I could continue the surveillance, gather evidence of their relationship and their plans, and build my own case before they realized I knew what they were planning. The next morning, I called in sick again and returned to my surveillance apartment. If Reed and Lena were meeting regularly on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I needed to document their conversations and activities. The evidence I'd gathered so far was suggestive, but not conclusive. I needed proof of their affair and their conspiracy to defraud me. I arrived at the apartment at noon and spent 2 hours fine-tuning the audio equipment. The contact microphones were working well, but I wanted to improve the clarity and range of the recordings. I also set up additional cameras to monitor the building's entrance and elevator bank, creating a comprehensive surveillance network that would document everyone who visited Lena's apartment. At 2:45 p.m., Lena arrived as expected. I watched through the telephoto lens as she entered the building and took the elevator to the 4th floor. 5 minutes later, I heard her moving around the apartment next door. At 3:15 p.m., Reed arrived. This time I was ready with multiple cameras and had positioned myself to capture clear images of his face and body language. He looked confident and relaxed, like a man visiting his girlfriend, rather than conducting business with a client. The conversation that followed was more detailed than the previous session. With improved audio equipment, I could hear both sides clearly. "How did he react when you told him about the apartment?" Reed asked. "He seemed to accept the explanation about client meetings," Lena replied, "but he's suspicious. You know how he gets when something doesn't make sense to him. His analytical background makes this more complicated. Most husbands would accept a simple explanation and move on. That's why we need to be extra careful. Grant notices details that other people miss." Reed laughed. "Good thing I know all his weaknesses. The prenup we drafted will protect you regardless of what he suspects." "What if he hires his own attorney?" "He won't. He trusts me completely. Besides, even if he did, we have a 6-month head start on documentation and preparation. By the time he realizes what's happening, it'll be too late for him to mount an effective defense." I listened to them plan my destruction with clinical detachment, recording every word while taking notes on their strategy. They discussed financial documents they'd need to copy, witnesses they could call to testify about my supposed misconduct, and timeline considerations for filing divorce papers. The most chilling part was how well they knew me. Reed accurately predicted my likely responses to various scenarios, while Lena provided insights into my daily routines and emotional triggers. They were using 15 years of marriage and friendship to craft a strategy designed to destroy me financially and emotionally. As the afternoon progressed, their conversation shifted from business to personal. They talked about their relationship, their plans for the future, and their excitement about being together openly once the divorce was finalized. Lena mentioned looking at houses in Reed's neighborhood, while Reed discussed introducing her to his family and professional contacts. They were planning a life together, funded by the assets they intended to steal from me through legal manipulation and fraud. At 6:30 p.m., they prepared to leave separately, as had become their routine. But before Reed departed, I heard something that made my hands shake with rage. "I almost feel sorry for him," Lena said. "Grant's a good man. He deserves better than what we're planning to do to him." "He'll survive," Reed replied, "and we'll be happy. Sometimes that's how life works. Someone has to lose for others to win." "I know, it's just 15 years of marriage. It feels strange to throw it all away for money and passion." "The marriage was already over," Reed said. We're just making it official and ensuring you're compensated for your time and emotional investment." They kissed goodbye. I could hear the soft sounds through the wall, and then Reed left. Lena remained in the apartment for another hour, probably cleaning up evidence of their meeting and preparing to return home to her unsuspecting husband. I sat in the dark apartment, listening to the recordings and reviewing the photographs I'd captured. I had evidence of their affair, documentation of their conspiracy to defraud me, and detailed knowledge of their timeline and strategy. Now I needed to decide what to do with that information. That night, I lay awake next to Lena, listening to her breathe and watching the ceiling fan rotate slowly in the darkness. She slept peacefully, like someone with a clear conscience, while I wrestled with rage and betrayal that threatened to consume me. I had evidence of her affair with Reed. I had recordings of them planning to destroy me financially through legal manipulation. I had photographs, financial records, and a clear understanding of their timeline and strategy. The question was, what should I do with that evidence? My first instinct was confrontation. Wake Lena up, play the recordings, demand explanations and apologies. Force her to admit what she'd been planning and give her a chance to call off the conspiracy. But that approach would accomplish nothing except alerting them that I knew about their plans. They'd adjust their strategy, accelerate their timeline, or simply become more careful about covering their tracks. My second instinct was to contact the police or the State Bar Association. Reed was clearly violating his ethical obligations as an attorney, using privileged information to defraud his clients. But proving that would require admitting I'd conducted illegal surveillance, which could invalidate my evidence and expose me to criminal charges. My third instinct was the one that ultimately won out. Fight fire with fire. Reed and Lena were using their professional expertise and inside knowledge to plan my destruction. They had months of preparation, legal documents crafted in their favor, and a strategy based on their intimate knowledge of my weaknesses and blind spots. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated me. I wasn't the same person Reed had known in college, or even the same person who'd hired him as my attorney 5 years ago. I'd spent a decade in intelligence work, learning how to gather information, analyze patterns, and exploit weaknesses in seemingly secure systems. I'd been trained to think strategically, to anticipate opponent moves, and to plan operations that achieved objectives while minimizing risk. Reed and Lena were amateurs playing at espionage. I was a professional. The next morning, while Lena was in the shower, I began implementing my counter-strategy. First, I needed to understand exactly what Reed had done to our legal documents and financial arrangements. I pulled out our prenuptial agreement, estate planning documents, and insurance policies, reading every word with new eyes. What I uncovered was far more troubling than I first thought. Reed had designed a legal structure that left me almost completely unprotected in a divorce. The prenuptial agreement included provisions that would shift most of our assets to Lena if she could demonstrate infidelity or financial wrongdoing on my part. Our insurance policies were arranged so she would receive the entire payout no matter how I was lost. Even our shared bank accounts had been altered to give her primary authority over withdrawals and transfers. I photographed every document, then began researching the legal precedents and state laws that governed each provision. If I was going to fight back, I needed to understand the battlefield as well as my opponents did. Next, I researched Reed's professional background and recent cases. What I discovered was a pattern of ethical violations that stretched back several years. Reed had been representing both parties in marital disputes, then switching sides when divorce proceedings began. He'd been using confidential information obtained during estate planning to craft divorce strategies that favored his chosen client. And in at least 3 cases, he'd been romantically involved with female clients during their divorce proceedings. The State Bar Association had strict rules about conflicts of interest and attorney-client relationships. If I could document Reed's pattern of violations, I could destroy his career and invalidate any legal documents he'd prepared for us. But I needed more than just evidence of ethical violations. I needed leverage that would force them to abandon their plans and leave me alone. That's when I remembered something Reed had told me during a dinner party 2 years ago. He'd been drinking heavily and had mentioned a case he'd handled involving a prominent local businessman. The man had been accused of embezzling funds from his company's pension plan, and Reed had helped him hide assets offshore to avoid seizure by federal investigators. At the time, I'd assumed Reed was exaggerating or joking. Lawyers love to tell war stories about their most challenging cases, often embellishing details to make themselves sound more clever or important. But now, I wondered if Reed had been telling the truth about helping a client commit federal crimes. I spent the afternoon researching the businessman Reed had mentioned. What I found was fascinating. The man had indeed been investigated for pension fund embezzlement, but the case had been dropped when investigators couldn't locate the missing assets. He'd paid a small fine for accounting irregularities and had been allowed to retire with his reputation largely intact. But if Reed had helped him hide assets offshore, that would constitute conspiracy to commit fraud and money laundering. Federal crimes with serious penalties for both the client and the attorney who'd assisted him. I needed proof, which meant I needed access to Reed's files and communications from that time period, and I knew exactly how to get it. Reed's law firm used the same IT consulting company that handled several of my corporate clients. I'd worked on their network security upgrades 2 years ago, which meant I still had administrative access to their systems. Access that Reed probably didn't know existed and certainly wouldn't expect me to use. That evening, while Lena worked late in her office, I connected to Reed's firm's network through a secure VPN. Their security protocols were laughably weak, passwords that hadn't been changed in months, user accounts with excessive privileges, and backup systems that stored everything in easily accessible formats. I found Reed's email archives and began searching for communications related to the embezzlement case. What I discovered was even better than I'd hoped. Reed hadn't just helped his client hide assets. He'd taken a substantial fee for the service and had used similar techniques to help several other clients avoid legitimate financial obligations. The email trail was comprehensive and damning. Reed had coordinated with offshore banking specialists, provided detailed instructions for moving money through shell corporations, and had even taken a percentage of the hidden assets as payment for his services. I downloaded everything, encrypted the files, and stored them on multiple secure servers. Then I began crafting my response strategy. Reed and Lena thought they were playing chess while I played checkers. Time to show them what a real strategic mind could accomplish. Over the next week, I continued my surveillance while simultaneously building my case against both of them. I documented every meeting, recorded every conversation, and gathered evidence of their affair and conspiracy. But I also began implementing countermeasures designed to protect my assets and neutralize their legal advantages. First, I quietly transferred funds from our joint accounts into individual retirement accounts and investment vehicles that would be harder for Lena to access or claim in a divorce. I was careful to stay within legal limits and to document everything properly, but I moved enough money to ensure I wouldn't be left destitute if their plans succeeded. Second, I began gathering evidence of Lena's affair that could be used in court if necessary. I hired a private investigator, using a false name and paying in cash, to document her visits to the downtown apartment. I also installed GPS tracking devices on her car and began monitoring her communications through the shared family plan on our cell phone accounts. Third, I researched Reed's other clients and recent cases, looking for additional evidence of ethical violations or criminal activity. What I found was a pattern of behavior that suggested Reed had been systematically defrauding clients and manipulating legal proceedings for years. But the most critical discovery came during a Thursday afternoon surveillance session in late April. Reed and Lena were talking through their schedule for filing divorce papers, and Reed mentioned something that sent a chill through me. "We need to be careful about the life insurance situation," he said. If something happened to Grant before the divorce is finalized, the investigation could uncover our relationship. What kind of investigation? Lena asked. Standard procedure when someone dies shortly before a major life change. The insurance company will look for signs of fraud or foul play. They'll review financial records, interview family members, examine recent legal documents. So we need to wait until after the divorce? Or find another way to handle the situation? There are options that would be less risky than waiting for natural causes. I sat frozen in the surveillance apartment, recording equipment running, as my wife and my attorney discussed the possibility of murdering me for insurance money. The discussion went on for another 20 minutes, but I barely absorbed any of it. They spoke about my disappearance as if it were a routine business matter, calmly balancing financial gains against possible risks and complications. By the time they finished their meeting, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for them to implement their plans. I wasn't going to try to reason with them or appeal to their better natures, and I wasn't going to rely on law enforcement or the legal system to protect me. I was going to destroy them both, completely and permanently, using every skill I'd learned in 10 years of intelligence work. The war had begun, and I intended to win. The next morning, I began implementing what I privately called Operation Scorched Earth. Reed and Lena had spent months planning my destruction, but they'd made a fatal error. They'd assumed I was the same trusting, passive person they'd always known. They were about to discover how wrong they were. My first target was Reed's law practice. I had evidence of his offshore money laundering scheme, his pattern of ethical violations, and his conspiracy to defraud me. But I needed to present that evidence in a way that would maximize damage while protecting my own legal position. I started by creating an anonymous email account and drafting a detailed complaint to the State Bar Association. The complaint outlined Reed's conflicts of interest, his romantic relationship with a current client, and his use of privileged information to manipulate legal proceedings. I attached selected emails from his firm's servers, carefully edited to remove any indication of how I'd obtained them. But I didn't send the complaint immediately. Instead, I held it as ammunition for the perfect moment. Next, I focused on Lena's professional reputation. Her PR firm prided itself on ethical practices and client confidentiality. If her colleagues and clients knew she was conducting an affair and planning to defraud her husband, it would destroy her credibility and cost her the senior partnership she'd worked years to achieve. I began documenting her lies and deceptions, building a timeline that showed how she'd used company resources to support her affair. The downtown apartment was paid for with funds from our joint account, which included money from her firm's profit-sharing program. Her Tuesday and Thursday absences from the office coincided with important client meetings that other staff members had to cover. And her recent promotion had been based partly on financial projections that assumed continued access to my income and assets. I prepared a comprehensive dossier on Lena's misconduct, complete with photographs, financial records, and recorded conversations. Like the complaint against Reed, I held it for strategic deployment at the optimal moment. But my most important preparation involved protecting myself from their planned attack. I knew they intended to accuse me of adultery and financial misconduct, so I needed to create an unshakable alibi and documentary evidence of my innocence. I began keeping detailed logs of my daily activities, complete with timestamps, locations, and witness contacts. I installed security cameras around our house and in my car, creating a comprehensive surveillance record that would prove my whereabouts at any given time. And I opened new bank accounts and investment portfolios, carefully documenting every transaction to demonstrate responsible financial management. I also began subtly gathering evidence of Lena's suspicious behavior. I photographed the clothes she wore to her client meetings and documented the times she left and returned home. I copied her appointment calendars and cross-referenced them with her actual whereabouts. and I began recording our conversations at home, capturing her lies and inconsistencies on audio. The surveillance equipment in the adjacent apartment continued to provide valuable intelligence. Reed and Lena met every Tuesday and Thursday, usually for 3 to 4 hours. Their conversations revealed increasingly detailed plans for the divorce proceedings, including strategies for hiding assets, discrediting my character, and maximizing Lena's settlement. But they also revealed something else: growing tension between the conspirators. Reed was becoming impatient with the timeline, pushing for faster action and more aggressive tactics. Lena was more cautious, worried about maintaining appearances and avoiding suspicion. Their relationship was showing signs of strain as the pressure of their deception mounted. I decided to exploit that weakness. In early May, I began implementing psychological pressure tactics designed to increase their stress and force them into making mistakes. I started asking Lena seemingly innocent questions about her work schedule, expressing concern about her long hours and frequent absences. I mentioned running into mutual acquaintances downtown, noting that I'd been surprised not to see her despite knowing she had meetings in the area. I also began dropping hints about our financial situation, mentioning investment opportunities, and suggesting we review our estate planning documents. Each comment was designed to make them wonder how much I knew and whether their timeline was still viable. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Lena became more defensive about her activities, offering elaborate explanations for simple questions. Reed started calling her more frequently, and their conversations became more urgent and paranoid. During a Thursday afternoon surveillance session in mid-May, I recorded a conversation that revealed just how much pressure they were feeling. "He's asking too many questions," Lena said. "Yesterday, he wanted to know why I was dressed up for a client meeting when my calendar showed I was supposed to be in the office all day." "What did you tell him?" "That the meeting was added at the last minute, but he looked skeptical." "Maybe we should move faster," Reed suggested. "File the papers next week and deal with the consequences." "No," Lena replied firmly. "We stick to the plan. If we rush now, we'll make mistakes that could cost us everything. Then we need to be more careful. No more meetings here until after the divorce is filed. Where else can we meet? Your office is too risky, and my house is obviously impossible." "I'll think of something. But we can't afford to have him discover what we're planning." I smiled as I listened to them struggle with the pressure I'd been applying. They were making exactly the kinds of mistakes I'd hoped for, becoming paranoid, second-guessing their strategy, and losing confidence in their ability to control the situation. But I wasn't finished with them yet. The next phase of my plan involved Reed's other victims. I'd identified 3 women who'd been divorced with Reed's assistance, all of whom had received unusually favorable settlements while their ex-husbands had been left with minimal assets. If I could convince those women to come forward with evidence of Reed's misconduct, it would strengthen my case and provide additional leverage. I began researching their backgrounds and current situations. 2 of the women had remarried and seemed to be living comfortable lives funded by their divorce settlements. But the 3rd woman, Patricia Hawkins, had a different story. Patricia had divorced her husband 2 years ago with Reed's assistance, receiving a settlement that included their house, most of their investments, and substantial ongoing support payments. But 6 months after the divorce was finalized, she'd discovered that Reed had been skimming money from her settlement and had used his position as her attorney to manipulate the proceedings in ways that benefited him personally. She'd filed a complaint with the State Bar Association, but Reed had used his connections and legal expertise to have the complaint dismissed on technical grounds. Patricia had been left with no recourse and no way to recover the money Reed had stolen from her. I contacted Patricia through an intermediary, explaining that I had evidence of Reed's ongoing misconduct and offering to help her pursue justice. She was initially suspicious. She'd been burned by lawyers before, but when I provided her with copies of Reed's emails about offshore money laundering, she became a valuable ally. Patricia had kept detailed records of her interactions with Reed, including financial documents that showed how he'd manipulated her settlement for his own benefit. She also had recordings of conversations where Reed had admitted to using similar tactics with other clients. Together, we began building a comprehensive case against Reed that would destroy his career and potentially result in criminal charges. But we agreed to hold our evidence until the optimal moment for maximum impact. That moment came sooner than expected. On a Thursday evening in late May, while monitoring the surveillance equipment in the adjacent apartment, I overheard Reed and Lena discussing an acceleration of their timeline. "I think he knows," Lena said, her voice tight with anxiety. "The way he's been looking at me, the questions he's been asking, I think he's figured out something is wrong." "What makes you think that?" "Last night he asked me about Metropolitan Property Management. He said he'd been reviewing our expenses and wanted to understand what services they were providing. I told him it was for client meetings, but he kept pressing for details." "Did you give him any?" "I made up something about conference room rentals and catering services, but he looked skeptical." Reed was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe it's time to implement the contingency plan." "What contingency plan?" "The life insurance option we discussed. If Grant dies in an accident, you inherit everything without having to go through a messy divorce. And there's no risk of him exposing our relationship or challenging the legal documents." I felt my hands clench into fists as I listened to them plan my murder with the same casual tone they might use to discuss weekend plans. "I don't know," Lena said. "That seems extreme and risky. Less risky than a divorce proceeding where he's suspicious and potentially gathering evidence against us. If something happened to him in the next few weeks, you'd be a wealthy widow instead of a defendant in a fraud investigation." "How would we make it look like an accident?" Reed laid out a plan that was both straightforward and chilling. They would fabricate a failed break-in, making it seem as though I'd been lost while attempting to protect our home. Lena would be conveniently away, visiting her sister in another state. The scene would be arranged to imply an unfortunate random incident rather than deliberate intent. As I listened to them fine-tune the details, I understood that my surveillance had exposed something far worse than an affair or financial deceit. I was married to a woman who was preparing to erase me for profit, aided by an attorney who treated such an outcome as an acceptable business solution. The time for psychological pressure and strategic maneuvering had passed. Now I needed to act decisively to protect my life and destroy my enemies before they could implement their plan. The next morning, I began implementing the final phase of Operation Scorched Earth. Reed and Lena had shown me exactly who they really were, and now I was going to show them what a real professional could accomplish when properly motivated. The war was about to end, and I intended to be the only survivor. I had 72 hours before Reed and Lena planned to implement their contingency plan. 72 hours to neutralize two people who had spent months planning to murder me for insurance money. The old Grant would have turned to the authorities, trusted the process, and believed things would work out fairly, but the old Grant had never overheard his wife and his lawyer calmly talking through how to make his disappearance look like a chance incident. The new Grant understood that sometimes justice required a more direct approach. My first call was to Patricia Hawkins. I explained that Reed was accelerating his timeline and that we needed to move immediately if we wanted to stop him. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "File your complaint with the State Bar Association this morning. Include everything: the financial manipulation, the skimmed settlement money, the pattern of client fraud. I'll provide additional evidence that will make the case impossible to dismiss." "What kind of evidence?" "Emails from Reed's servers showing his offshore money laundering scheme, financial records proving he's been systematically defrauding clients for years, and recordings of him discussing plans to commit additional crimes." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "How did you get recordings of private conversations?" "Let's just say Reed isn't as careful about operational security as he thinks he is." I spent the morning preparing the evidence package for Patricia's complaint. Reed's emails about offshore banking, his communications with Shell Corporation specialists, his detailed instructions for hiding client assets from federal investigators. I included financial records showing the fees he'd received for these services and a timeline demonstrating the scope of his criminal enterprise. But I also included something else. Selected excerpts from the recordings I'd made in the adjacent apartment, carefully edited to focus on Reed's admissions of professional misconduct while omitting any references to murder plans or my surveillance activities. The package was devastating and comprehensive. Even Reed's political connections and legal expertise wouldn't be able to save him from this level of documented criminal activity. While Patricia filed her complaint, I focused on Lena's destruction. Her PR firm had a strict code of ethics and a reputation for integrity that was essential to their business model. If her colleagues and clients knew she was conducting an affair while planning to defraud and potentially murder her husband, it would destroy the firm's credibility and cost them millions in lost business. I prepared a detailed dossier on Lena's activities, including photographs of her entering and leaving the downtown apartment, financial records showing how she'd used company resources to support her affair, and a timeline demonstrating her deception and manipulation. But the centerpiece of the dossier was a carefully edited audio recording of Lena discussing her plans to divorce me through fraud and manipulation. I'd removed any references to murder or illegal surveillance, focusing instead on her admissions of adultery, financial deception, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I sent the dossier to Lena's business partners, her major clients, and several journalists who covered the local business community. The package was accompanied by a cover letter explaining that I was a concerned citizen who'd discovered evidence of serious professional misconduct and felt obligated to bring it to their attention. Next, I contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and provided them with evidence of Reed's money laundering activities. I used an anonymous tip line and provided detailed information about his offshore banking schemes, his Shell Corporation network, and his pattern of helping clients hide assets from federal investigators. The federal investigation would take months to develop, but it would ensure that Reed faced serious criminal charges even if he managed to survive the State Bar Association's disciplinary proceedings. But my most important preparation involved protecting myself from their planned attack. I knew Reed and Lena intended to stage a home invasion robbery, which meant I needed to be somewhere else when they implemented their plan. I booked a business trip to a client conference in Chicago, creating a documented alibi that would place me hundreds of miles away during the time frame they'd discussed for my murder. I made sure to use credit cards and attend events that would create a comprehensive paper trail of my whereabouts. But I also prepared a surprise for anyone who tried to break into our house while I was gone. I installed additional security cameras throughout the property, including hidden units that would capture high-definition footage of any intruders. I also set up motion sensors and automated recording systems that would document any attempt to stage a crime scene. Most importantly, I placed a packet of evidence in our home safe, along with a letter detailing everything I had uncovered about Reed and Lena's scheme. If anything happened to me despite my precautions, that material would make sure those responsible were held accountable. On Tuesday morning, I flew to Chicago as planned. From my hotel room, I monitored the security cameras at our house and tracked Lena's movements through the GPS device I'd installed in her car. Everything proceeded exactly as I'd expected. Lena left work early, claiming she felt sick and needed to go home to rest. But instead of going home, she drove to her sister's house in Pennsylvania, creating an alibi for the evening Reed planned to break into our house. Reed, meanwhile, spent the afternoon purchasing supplies that would support their cover story: rope, duct tape, a crowbar, and other items that would suggest a violent robbery. He paid cash and wore a baseball cap and sunglasses to avoid identification by security cameras. At 9:47 p.m. Chicago time, my home security system detected movement in our backyard. I watched through the cameras as Reed approached the house, wearing dark clothing and carrying a bag of supplies. He used the crowbar to force open the back door, then moved through the house looking for valuable items to steal. But he also did something else. He planted evidence designed to support the robbery scenario, including drug paraphernalia that would suggest the intruders were desperate addicts willing to commit violence for quick cash. Reed spent nearly an hour in the house, setting up the crime scene and preparing for what he believed would be my return from a late evening at the office. He had no idea I was 800 miles away, watching his every move and recording evidence that would send him to prison for the rest of his life. At 11:15 p.m., Reed's phone rang. I couldn't hear the conversation, but his body language suggested surprise and alarm. He quickly gathered his supplies and left the house, driving away without implementing the violent conclusion to his plan. I later learned that Lena had called to warn him that I hadn't come home as expected. My car wasn't in the garage, and the house appeared empty. She was worried that I'd somehow discovered their plan and was staying away deliberately. They were right to be worried. The next morning, while still in Chicago, I received a call from Patricia Hawkins. "The State Bar Association has opened a formal investigation," she reported. "Reed's been suspended pending the outcome, and his law firm has been placed under administrative review." "What about the federal investigation?" "FBI agents raided his office this morning. They seized his computers, financial records, and client files. I heard they also executed search warrants at his home and his offshore banking contacts." I smiled as I imagined Reed's reaction to discovering that his carefully constructed criminal enterprise was collapsing around him. But the best was yet to come. That afternoon, Lena called me in Chicago. "Grant, something terrible has happened," she said, her voice shaking with what sounded like genuine distress. "Reed's been arrested. The FBI thinks he's been involved in money laundering and client fraud." "That's shocking," I replied, putting appropriate surprise and concern in my voice. "What does this mean for our legal affairs?" "I don't know. The State Bar Association has frozen all his client files pending their investigation. We might need to find a new attorney." "Probably a good idea. I never completely trusted Reed anyway." There was a long pause. "What do you mean?" "Just a feeling I had. He always seemed a little too smooth, a little too eager to find creative solutions to complex problems. I wondered if he was cutting corners." Another pause, longer this time. "I need to tell you something, Grant. Something important." "What is it?" "When you get back from Chicago, we need to talk about our marriage, about our future, about some mistakes I've made." I could hear the fear in her voice. Reed's arrest had shattered their conspiracy and left her exposed and vulnerable. She was probably hoping to confess to the affair and negotiate some kind of reconciliation before I discovered the full extent of their plans. "Of course," I said. "We'll talk when I get home." But I had no intention of giving her the chance to manipulate me with partial truths and false remorse. I'd heard her discuss my murder with casual indifference. I'd watched her plan to steal my assets and destroy my reputation, and I'd documented every detail of their conspiracy with the thoroughness of a trained intelligence professional. The conversation we were going to have wouldn't be the one she expected. I returned from Chicago on Friday evening to find Lena waiting in our living room, dressed in the black dress she'd worn to our wedding anniversary dinner 2 years ago. She'd prepared my favorite meal and opened a bottle of expensive wine, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and reconciliation. "Welcome home," she said, kissing me at the door. "How was the conference?" "Productive," I replied. "Lots of new business opportunities." We had dinner and made small talk about my trip and her work week. She didn't mention Reed's arrest or her planned confession, instead focusing on pleasant memories and shared experiences from our marriage. But I could see the tension in her posture, the way she kept glancing at me when she thought I wasn't looking. She was trying to gauge my mood and find the right moment to begin what she probably hoped would be a carefully scripted performance of remorse and reconciliation. After dinner, we moved to the living room with our wine. Lena curled up next to me on the couch, her head on my shoulder, like she'd done thousands of times during our marriage. "Grant," she said softly, "I need to tell you about some things that have been happening. Some mistakes I've made." "What kind of mistakes?" She took a deep breath. "I've been having an affair." I turned to look at her, putting appropriate shock and hurt in my expression. "With whom?" "Reed." "Reed Trenner? Our attorney?" "Yes." She was crying now, tears that might have been genuine or might have been calculated for maximum emotional impact. "It started 6 months ago. We were working on the estate planning updates, and we began spending time together outside the office. One thing led to another." "How long has it been going on?" 6 months. But Grant, it's over now. Reed's arrest made me realize how stupid I've been, how much I've risked for something that was never real." I stood up and walked to the window, staring out at our backyard, where Reed had broken in just 3 days earlier. "Is that why we have the downtown apartment? For your affair?" She looked surprised that I knew about the apartment, but nodded. "Yes. I'm sorry, Grant. I know I should have told you sooner." "What else should you have told me?" "What do you mean?" I turned back to face her. "Lena, I know about the prenuptial agreement modifications. I know about the offshore accounts Reed set up. I know about the plans to file for divorce and claim that I'd committed adultery or financial misconduct." The color drained from her face. "How do you know about that?" "I'm a former NSA analyst, Lena. Finding hidden information is what I do for a living." She stood up, her composure finally cracking. "Grant, you have to understand. Reed convinced me that you were planning to leave me. He showed me financial records that suggested you were hiding assets and preparing for divorce. I thought I was protecting myself." "Really? And what about the life insurance discussions? Were you protecting yourself when you and Reed planned to stage my murder to look like a home invasion robbery?" She stared at me in shock, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Finally, she whispered, "You heard that?" "I heard everything, Lena. Every conversation, every plan, every offhand discussion about how to eliminate your husband for the insurance payout." She collapsed back onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. "Grant, please. You have to believe me. I never would have gone through with that. It was Reed's idea, and I told him it was too extreme." "You told him it was risky. There's a difference." I walked to our home safe and retrieved the package of evidence I'd prepared. "Here's what's going to happen, Lena. Tomorrow morning, you're going to pack your things and leave this house. You're going to resign from your job and disappear from my life permanently." "Grant, please. If you try to contact me, if you try to claim any of our assets, if you try to salvage your reputation or your career, I'll release evidence that will destroy you completely. Evidence of your affair, your conspiracy to commit fraud, and your plans to murder me for insurance money." I handed her a flash drive containing selected recordings and documents. "This is a sample of what I have. The full collection is stored in multiple secure locations, along with instructions for its release if anything happens to me." She looked at the flash drive like it was a poisonous snake. "What about the house? Our investments? I have a right to half of everything. You forfeited those rights when you planned to murder me. Be grateful I'm not having you arrested for conspiracy to commit homicide." Lena stared at me for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. "I loved you, Grant. For 15 years, I really loved you." "No," I replied. "You loved what I could provide: money, security, respectability. When Reed offered you a better deal, you didn't hesitate to betray everything we'd built together." She nodded slowly, finally understanding that there would be no negotiation, no reconciliation, no second chances. "What happens to Reed?" "Reed is going to prison for a very long time. The FBI has enough evidence to convict him of money laundering, fraud, and conspiracy. He'll be lucky if he serves less than 20 years. I walked to the front door and held it open. You have until tomorrow morning to pack your things and leave. After that, I never want to see you again." Lena gathered her purse and coat, moving like someone in a trance. At the door, she turned back to me one last time. "I'm sorry, Grant, for all of it." "So am I," I replied. "Sorry that I married someone capable of planning my murder. Sorry that I trusted people who saw me as nothing more than a source of money. And sorry that it took me 15 years to see who you really were." She left without another word, and I locked the door behind her. I never saw Lena again. She left town the next morning and never returned. Her resignation from the PR firm was accepted without explanation, and her former colleagues were told she'd decided to pursue opportunities in another state. Reed was convicted on 14 federal charges and sentenced to 25 years in prison. His law firm dissolved, his assets were seized to pay restitution to his victims, and his legal license was permanently revoked. The house felt different without Lena's presence, quieter, but also more peaceful. I kept the apartment at the Meridian for another 6 months, using it as a home office and a reminder of how much I'd learned about the people I'd trusted most. Eventually, I sold the downtown apartment and moved on with my life. I never remarried, but I built a successful consulting business and developed friendships based on honesty rather than convenience. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the conversation I overheard through the wall of that adjacent apartment. The casual way Reed and Lena had discussed ending my life for insurance money. The complete absence of guilt or remorse in their voices. I'd spent 15 years married to someone who'd been willing to murder me for money, and I'd never suspected a thing. That knowledge changed me in ways I'm still discovering. But I survived. I won. And I learned that sometimes the most important intelligence comes from the people who think you're not listening. The adjacent witness sees everything, and sometimes that's enough.